This week's Torah reading is Parshat VaEra, and it contains within it the first seven of the 10 plagues, which culminate in the 10th plague, the passing of the firstborn, the smiting of the firstborn, which culminates in the Jewish people being kicked out of Egypt and becoming redeemed by God. Then 7 weeks later, finding ourselves at Mount Sinai and having the revelation of receiving the Torah at Sinai. So it's a process that begins. And the title of this class is You've Got a Friend. But I want to start by asking a question which parallels the question we asked last week. Last week, we discussed the idea in Pirkei Avot, in the 5th chapter, that it says that God created the world with 10 statements. And the Mishnah itself there questions, why 10? Why didn't God create the world basically in one statement? And we explained last week that fulfilling the purpose of creation is an incremental process. It's not a grandiose moment of thunder and lightning and standing at Sinai and captivating the Oscar for best performance as Moses, but rather it's a question of people developing step by step by step through their decision making, through the actions they take. And really, I hope I mentioned last week this definition that a tzaddik, a very righteous person, can be defined as a person who's making the correct choice right now. That's a tzaddik. And a lot of times people get down on themselves. They feel as though my life has become irredeemable. And that's never the case, because a simple conviction to pursue fulfillment of the Torah and fulfill the purpose of creation, as we said from the idea of Pirkei Avot last week, that it shows the reason why the world was created every time a person fulfills a precept of the Torah, every time a person fulfills a kindness, every time a person undertakes to do something for the good of the community and the good of others, every time a person fulfills Sabbath observance or kashrut or any other discipline or restriction or positive commandment or kindness or building up the world in a way that fulfills the world. That's what creation was all about. And I want to therefore ask the question, why 10 plagues? And just as a parallel question, certainly God could have come in and I'll give a simple example. Just take the 9th plague of darkness. The Egyptians were mired in darkness. They had no idea what was going on around them. God could have had that one plague take place. Jewish people could have packed their bags and headed out of town, and nobody would have known the difference. So clearly, the plagues themselves, having 10 plagues and having them organized the way that they are, has to have a lot of meaning and a lot of purpose to it and important messages for us. So we'll begin by trying to explore this question by looking at the plagues themselves. And I want to also, what?
Excuse me, can I interrupt?
Sure, please.
Doesn't it say somewhere that God told Moses that the Egyptians were not going to listen?
Yes.
So,
God did explain to Moshe that it would be a long haul. But and God says that and explains to Moshe over and over again, I'm hardening Paro's heart, which is understood differently by different commentaries. My personal, and fitting in with the theme of this class, the Seforno says that God did not want Pharaoh to release the Jewish people under duress. He wanted Pharaoh to choose through an educational process to free the Jewish people. And hence, God was patient, just like any teacher would be with a student. Now, there's something else, and this goes back to the end of last week's Torah reading, but at the same time where God explains to Moshe that it's going to be a process, God also explains, and he says, he calls the Jewish people B'ni B'chori Yisrael. This is in chapter 4, sentence 22. He explains to Moshe that the process that's beginning of redemption is me, God, dealing with my firstborn child, Israel, which has a lot of implications to it. And then he does have the foreboding warning that you need to inform Paro that should Paro not honor the legacy or the place in the universe of the Jewish people as God's firstborn, it will cost him and Egypt their firstborns. So even though, and there is some controversy in some of the commentaries whether that was told to Paro up front or not, or told to Paro later on, but God's laying out a scenario here. And I think it's very important to understand this. God is not as characterized by the outside world, this idea of vindictive, angry, God having an impatient sense of, okay, if you're not going to listen to me, I'll hit you over here and I'll hit you over there and I'll hit you over at the other place. God at the outset sets out with this idea that the Jewish people have a unique place in history as the firstborn child. Now, understand something. I mean, many of us have firstborn children. We don't take care of them to the exclusion of the rest of our kids. So it's a very beautiful statement to say that this child of mine, so to speak, has a special role in the world. And therefore, I treat this child as though the firstborn, like the exemplar, the one who's going to set the standard, the one who's going to lead the way. And that's the way firstborn children are understood to be. But it also has the explanation that the rest of the children will benefit through my relationship with this child. Now, and this is not a commentary on the very unfortunate, horrific events going on in Iran right now, but I think people have heard me say in this class very many times, if I was named the foreign minister of Israel tomorrow, I would do one thing. I would travel around the world, and I would simply sit down with anybody who starts up with the Jewish people and say, look, start up with someone else. Look at history.
Yeah.
Look at what has happened to each and every empire, no matter how powerful, no matter how mighty, that starts up with the Jewish people. And I'm not, I don't want to get into the politics here, but I would tell you something that I think it seems true to me. Putin, who certainly is a despot and certainly is a person who has no concern for anybody else but himself in the world, he never starts up with the Jewish people. And to an amazing extent, he seems to have this détente with Israel. At the height of the Syrian ISIS stuff, Israel was flying sorties into areas that were under Russian supervision in Syria to defend themselves in total cooperation with the Russian airport. There's a lot of stuff going on with that. So Putin seems to, besides being a cat with 9 lives, he seems to me to be a tyrant who reads history and who thinks to himself, okay, I've got a good thing going for me. I'm making a few $1 billion a year or whatever he's doing. I'm in a nice, powerful position. I'm able to subdue millions of people at my behest. And I'm able to, build Mother Russia up to be seeming a power in the world, even though it doesn't play out so well on the battlefield. But in any event, he's smart enough to say the Jewish people are people. I may be friends with all of their enemies, and I may, have called the Ayatollah up and say, if you need a spot, we've got a nice, comfortable place for you here outside of Moscow that you could live with for the rest of your life. But he seems to be meticulous about not directly threatening and infringing Israel. But that's an aside here. What I want to get back to is this idea when God approaches this from the perspective of the Jewish people, my firstborn, they're going to impact the whole world for the good. And Paro should hear that and understand that. Now, first of all, it's a tremendous echo to so many of the events in the book of Bereshit, in the book of Genesis. The business about Yosef with the coat of many colors and being anointed by his father as a future leader of the Jewish people with the dreams. It's Cain and Abel bringing offerings before God. It's something that seems to just pop up over and over again in the Torah. And I don't subscribe to the idea of sibling rivalry, which I know other people have said. I think it's more a question of understanding that everyone has a legitimate place in the world to make a difference and to be important. And it's not necessarily being top dog. You may be the left tackle on the team and not necessarily the quarterback. And you still get a ring when you win the Super Bowl. That type of an approach. So here's what I want to make of this and then show how this fits in so much with so many instances within this week's Torah reading. So and that's the title of this class, You've Got a Friend in Me, where God starts off and says to this, the Jewish people are very important for the benefit of the entire world. They're not important to the exclusion of the rest of the world. And nobody knows this better than us, because in our prayers every day, we talk about the world coming to acknowledge God. And we know that our view of ultimate redemption of the world is that all people will recognize God as the sovereign creator of the world and want to do their part in keeping with that understanding. And that's all part of what God tells Moshe, this is your job to do in the world. This is also a reason, in my view, why when we talk about the 10 plagues at the Seder, we spill out little bits of wine from our cup for each of the plagues out of deference to the pain and suffering to the Egyptians. If it's a question of vengeance or righting all wrongs or God, coming out from behind the curtain, so to speak, angry and wielding a sword, and we do talk about God having a mighty hand in the world, revealing that, but a mighty hand just means, let's get real here. This is my creation, and I do have goals and meaning for the world, and I do have a plan for things here, and I do have a people, Israel, that have an important role to play here, and I need to protect that. And I think that's the healthiest way for us to understand it. And that also will explain why the 10 plagues required 10 plagues, because there had to be an incremental approach, not to subduing Paro under duress, but rather giving Paro opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to acknowledge God's sovereignty, number one, and number two, acknowledge Israel's importance within God's sovereignty of the world in fulfilling the purpose of the world. And the process, that's the process that takes place. And I'll use an example. There's a medrash that says as follows. Why was the Nile River turning into blood the first of the plagues? Now, we do explain to kids commonly, and it is Rashi and everything else there, that they worshiped the Nile River. They thought the Nile was a god, and that's not such a silly idea as we might think, because the Nile River provided them with a robust economy and a source of strength and power, and it was their river, and based on their relationship with their river, they were the greatest empire of the world at that time. So the idea of worshiping it, it may not be any different than things about America that we all worship, whether it's, landing in San Diego and looking across the bay and seeing the nuclear-powered aircraft carriers there and thinking, wow, isn't it amazing to be a citizen of a country that has that, could project that type of military supremacy any place in the world, and how rare that is. That was their relationship to the Nile River. And that is a true explanation, and that's also part of the education for Paro to come to understand that even if you have the largest array of nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, it still doesn't mean that there could be another nation or another people who have a more significant role in the fulfillment of creation. Okay, so that could be part of the lesson. But there's a specific medrash that says that why did the Nile River turn to blood? Because Paro chose to throw the baby boys of the Jewish people into the Nile River. Now, I've seen many people understand that medrash as indicating that God was really angry. I'm going to give it to them. They had the nerve of throwing the children of my favorite children into the Nile River, heartless, cruel. They're going to have to pay for that. But there's a different aspect to that. The first aspect of that I think needs to be understood, and I think this medrash indicates it, is that having suffered, and as people say all the time in the Haggadahs, only 210 years of slavery, it wasn't the whole 400, as if 210 years of slavery was not immensely significant. And even if you want to narrow it down to the 80 years of harsh, crushing subjugation that Chazal, the rabbis, tell us it was, as a Holocaust survivor said once publicly, he said, just imagine if Auschwitz had lasted for 80 years instead of the 4 or 5 years it did last. How many, or the 3 or 4 years it did last, how many millions and millions could it have consumed? So we're talking about a situation here where God first and foremost wanted the Jewish people to understand that the crime of throwing babies into the Nile, which produces no evidence of wrongdoing, there's no body, there's no blood, there's no crime scene to investigate. God forbid, you take a child, you throw him into a river, it's swept down the river, it disappears from all memory. Family comes looking for their child. Where is our child? Just as, Nebuch right now, millions of people are looking for relatives who were disappeared in all these different countries that have been ruled so harshly. And there's no graveyard to investigate. There's no bloodstains. There's no nothing. So that medrash explains that God wanted us to understand, as he told Moshe at the burning bush, I see the difficulties that the Jewish people are undergoing. So in other words, every crime, no matter how covered up it is, no matter how impossible it would be for some human court of investigation to ever hold anyone accountable for, I, God, have been with you through every bit of travail and every bit of difficulty. I could account for every child that was thrown into that river, and therefore every drop of blood that was swallowed up there could be returned back to be visible evidence of the crime that was committed and to be visible evidence of the empathy and concern and awareness that God had or has for the suffering that the Jewish people underwent. So I just want to caution each of us, as we approach the Torah's account of things, we really need to understand that sentence in the prophets, "Lo achpos b'mos hames," that God has no interest in the evil person dying. That's not God's agenda. God's agenda is for every human being to be experientially given the greatest opportunity possible to live a meaningful, fulfilling life, building up and as we said in last week's mission, Pirkei Avos, mekaymin, like certifying the fact that God created the world with a purpose, and the purpose is spiritual, and that in every spiritual endeavor, there's going to be leaders and followers involved. When you go into the Beit HaMikdash, there's an area that only the high priest can go, and there's an area that only the Kohanim can go, and there's an area that only the Levites can go, and there's an area that the rest of us Jews can go, and then there's an area where Gentile people can go. And those are marked out not for discriminatory purposes, but for clarity's sake, that there's a spiritual agenda here, and that spiritual agenda includes all of us, but includes each of us in an individual role, in an individual place within God's world. Another a source that I unfortunately can't find the sentence on my way in here, but the Sephorno on one of the plagues reads into the words that Moshe says to Pharaoh. And basically, he says, Moshe was saying to Pharaoh, do you know what a sanctification of God's name it will be when you release the Jewish people and let them go? Now, the fact that the Sephorno reads that into the Torah, and we're talking about Moshe speaking to Pharaoh. I mean, we could extrapolate. In other words, if you had 10 minutes with the Ayatollah in Iran right now, and would you think of saying to him, if you tomorrow get up and say we were wrong to persecute Israel and the Jewish people, and we regret every missile and every terrorist act and every dollar that we spent trying to wipe them off the face of the earth, because we see now that there's a truth that the Jewish people have an important role to play in the history of mankind. So the Sephorno says that that was a message that Moshe was delivering to Pharaoh, and look what he's appealing to. He's appealing to a level of spiritual humanity within the greatest despot on earth at that moment, and feeling as though that will resonate with him. Because after all, he also is a child of God. Now, it doesn't, this is not it's not fantasy land. It's a question of understanding that all human beings being created in the image of Hashem is a truth. And therefore, people never escape or never really can cast aside that endurable identity within themselves. And certainly, we know for us as a Jewish people, we have countless examples of people who seemingly betrayed the Jewish people in the end, taking on heroic roles to save the Jewish people. And as a friend of mine commented recently, says when you look at the history of Zionism and you realize that at one point in time there were a group of rabbis sitting talking to Herzl about settling the land of Israel, and he had a Christmas tree in his house because that's where he was at in terms of his worldview. And you think how bizarre that is. But that also has an amazing message that here was a Jewish man who was very, very secular, who really out of the blue, as he saw the naked face of anti-Semitism in France covering it as a journalist, all of a sudden became the father of modern Zionism, albeit not religious Zionism, okay, whatever you want to say, but he could do so with a Christmas tree in his house. And this also is a testimony to the complexity and the depth within all people. So what I would like us to do is to keep our eyes and ears open to the idea that the beginning of this parsha is VaEra, God appears to Moshe and Aaron. And the way God is chastising them, I never used with the forefathers of the Jewish people, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I never had to deliver on my promises, and they trusted me. And here you're not trusting me so much, and I am delivering on my promises. That's part of the undertow that's there. But the idea that God appeared, that's what this parsha is about. VaEra, God appears. And God appears as the devoted friend and champion of us, the firstborn people, simply because of the dedication of the forefathers and the homes that they established, and simply because God could foresee, God doesn't have to foresee anything, but God could see that even a couple of thousand years down the road, we would still be the champions of these ideas and this way of seeing the world and this way of understanding the world. And so I have a few other sources from the place, but I think we're pretty much out of time here. So God's appearance in the world is always meant for only one thing. It's to help transform us as people. And I thought I would end today with a Hasidic moment, since I'm now bombarded with Hasidic Torah where I'm living. But when Moshe comes to the burning bush in last week's Torah reading, so what's the first thing that God says to him? Take your shoes off, okay? Sim no na'alecha me'al raglecha. Now, it happens to be that the word for shoes in Hebrew, na'alayim, is the same word as to lock something up. Linola tadelet, lock the door. So I guess the idea was that your feet, normally people don't wear shoes. Once upon a time, I have a good friend who went to school, was embarrassed to be wearing shoes once upon a time, and had to hide them from his friends because he didn't want to be the only one wearing them. So shoes are a constraint. They like lock your feet up. Now, of course, feet, raglayim, is always associated conceptually with hergel, same word, with your routine. And in a certain sense, what God was saying to Moshe was, and this is not the literal explanation, but it's a conceptual explanation, that Moshe, you're an 80-year-old man, and you've proven yourself to be a devoted leader concerned about the Jewish people. But now you have to let all constraint go. Because if you're going to lead the people out of Egypt, and if you're going to be standing at Mount Sinai when Revelation takes place, and if you're going to guide the people, hopefully all the way into the land of Israel, that didn't quite happen, but at least to the border of the land of Israel, you're going to have to be transformed as a person also along the way. And you're going to have to lose those you're going to have to open those locks like like Houdini at the bottom of the pool of water. Find a way to just become, release yourself from every bond that might limit you, so that you can become this truly extraordinary being who could accomplish this for the world and be the paradigm of it throughout history. And we need to read these parshiot of the Torah in the same way. That these parshiot in the Torah, if we look for the extreme sense of God's interest in every individual person, tzaddik and rasha, righteous person and evil person, and God's interest in transformative experiences, opening up new ways of thinking about the world, new ways of acting, ways of really making the world into an unbelievably special place. If we look for that within the Parshiot, we will find it. And I think if we look for it within our lives, we will find it as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Can I make a comment here?
Please.
So on February the 3rd, we are bringing out a fellow named Omer